Because they've lived in this country for years. Now they are being forced to go home. Nearly 36 Liberian natives live here in the Triad, but they and thousands of others across the country face a March 31st deadline for deportation.
Tonight they're appealing to President Obama and Congress to let them stay.
Margaret Johnson is live in our newsroom with tonight's big story at 6 o'clock. Margot.
Well, tonight we talk with one of the women on the list to be sent home, why she calls the situation unfair, plus the local efforts to change hearts in Washington.
It's been good, but now I'm sort of disabled.
For 22 years, Vera Clark has called the Triad home. The 60-year-old Liberian native lives and goes to church in Winston-Salem, makes a living taking care of children in her home, a lifestyle now threatened as Vera faces a March 31st deadline for deportation.
It's not fair to have been here, paying your taxes, following the laws, and then be told you don't have a future here anymore.
She is among the thousands of Liberians the U.S. gave temporary protective status as civil war ravaged the African nation. Vera remembers barely making it out of the country alive with a gun pointed at her head.
And several times they had it cocked. It was with live ammo in it.
18 years later, conditions are starting to improve, and the American government is preparing to send the Liberians home. But they don't want to go. Many of them have families, jobs, and homes, and are sending money to their relatives in Africa who are struggling as the country tries to rebuild.
A lot of stress, and people on the phone calling. Have you heard anything yet?
The Liberians who are here are desperate.
Pressure from well-known people with clout may be their only hope.
I hope we can think better.
Please take a stand to keep...
State Representative Larry Womble has even sent a letter to President Obama imploring him to let the Liberians stay, saying the country's infrastructure is nowhere near ready to handle an influx of that many people.
I've always been taught, it's an old axiom, in order to take a pig and make him into a hog, he has to be fed. He has to grow. And Liberia is just like a baby now.
Back at Vera Clark's house, she's asking America to remember what they have in common.
Liberia has been an ally of the United States for a long, long time.
In fact, they call themselves Americo-Liberians, freed slaves who left the U.S. and settled in Liberia, even naming their country after a U.S. president. So they believe the two sides have a strong connection. So the Liberians are asking the community to call your representatives in Washington and tell them you want them to stay.
Hello everyone, it's Jabbar here. Today's video is a patron request. If you would like to make a video request of your own, you can do so by becoming a patron. A link to this can be found below. Liberia. A country of 4.7 million people belonging to 20 unique ethnic groups. A number that is growing rapidly as the average Liberian woman gives birth to about 5 children throughout her life. Due to a combination of Liberia's high fertility rate and its high mortality rate from local disease, over half of its population is under the age of 25. This small country was also one of the 3 West African countries most heavily plagued by the 2014 Ebola outbreak, along with the neighboring countries of Guinea and Sierra Leone. To add insult to injury, the country is still recovering from 2 bloody civil wars, the most recent one ending just a decade ago. My intentions were not to create a video that perpetuates negativity, but it is necessary that I put this out there ahead of time in order to fully dissect the context of this video. So let's get started with the founding of the modern day country of Liberia. Prior to the formation of the modern day country, Liberia was composed of a collection of small kingdoms and chiefdoms. Among these were the Kru people, a resilient group who were popularly regarded as expert sailors and advocated a culture that chose death over being taken into slavery. Early European merchants referred to the area as the Pepper Coast, and eventually, the Grain Coast. And I'm sure you can probably guess why. As much as I'd like to continue talking about the early history of this area, the purpose of this video is to discuss the modern state of Liberia. So let's continue. In 1816, white Americans saw the ever-growing threat of black American freedmen as their numbers continued to grow at an alarming rate. In response to this, they founded an organization known as the American Colonization Society. It was originally founded with the intentions to relocate black freedmen from the South and into areas where they would not pose any potential threat to the stability of slave owners or their plantations. However, over time, it would become dominated by people who were largely anti-slavery activists who wanted to relocate blacks for humanitarian reasons. Their goal was to move black people to a place where they'd be able to live in a society that treated them as equals and thus allow for a better chance to lead successful lives. The United States wanted to establish a colony in Africa to do just that. Though this plan sounded good on paper, there were a few major problems with it. Problem number one was that the indigenous peoples of Liberia were unwilling to sell any land to the United States for the establishment of this colony. The settlers had to take refuge on the nearby Scarbo Island until they were able to procure territory on the mainland. These American ships sailed all along the coast of West Africa, searching for suitable land to establish the colony, but every group they encountered declined any offers to sell their lands. Eventually, Naval Officer Lieutenant Robert Stockton forced a local leader to sell a strip of land to them. As a result of this, his newly established African colony was continuously attacked by locals in 1824 and had to be fortified to avoid being overrun. The second problem is that blacks being sent to this area likely did not descend from locals, and thus could not relate to the indigenous peoples or their ways of life. And problem number three was that even if they were ethnically related to the locals, most of them were born and raised in the United States, given American names, and therefore accustomed to American language, culture, religion, and overall ways of life, which greatly differ from that of the local practices. This led to tensions between the locals and the immigrants, but we'll cover that shortly. For now, we'll continue discussing the formation of Liberia. After being fortified and protected from angry locals, the colony was named Liberia in 1847, and its capital was named Monrovia in honor of President James Monroe, as he was credited with supplying much of the funds to the project from the US Treasury. In addition to the initial point of settlement, other colonization societies purchased more land to add to the colony and sent thousands of slaves who were freed after the abolition of the slave trade. Because it was not internationally recognized as a sovereign state, European merchants continuously undermined Liberia's influence by trading in and out of its borders without permission. The British were the ones to first recognize the Republic of Liberia, making it the first republic in Africa, and they signed treaties of friendship and commerce in the year 1848. Despite the United States' foundational role in the founding of Liberia, they still did not recognize Liberia as a sovereign state, likely due to fears of the impact that it would have on slavery. As a result of this, no massive migration of freed slaves ever happened, even though that was the basis of Liberia's establishment in the first place. It wasn't until late 1862 that the United States finally recognized Liberia's sovereignty and established official relations with them. Over the next century, ties between Liberia and the United States remained close, perhaps too close. Freed slaves began to pour in and make this place into their home. During this time, heavy modernization began to trickle along the coast where schools, hospitals, and local shipbuilding industries and trade expanded rapidly. Another thing that happened during this time was an attempt to establish firm control over the native populations further inland. But these attempts were halted after the American Colonization Society withdrew its funding, leaving Liberia to depend on exports of local raw materials and agricultural products, which did not generate enough income to modernize their nation. As a result of this, they were forced to take out massive loans from foreign lenders to compensate. In 1909, the Liberian government officially declared bankruptcy. With assistance largely from the United States government, Liberia was able to climb out of its hole, but followed up with poor economic decisions and relied heavily on foreign leases and loans to bring revenue into the country. These foreign leases and loans only served to worsen Liberia's financial burdens. To make matters even worse, tensions between the American descendant blacks and the indigenous peoples were high throughout the history of Liberia. The ruling minority, for example, was composed entirely of Americo-Liberians, which was an ethnic group that descended from the founding wave of freed slaves in the early 19th century, who composed just 5% of Liberia's population, yet controlled the majority of the government and its wealth. These Americo-Liberians built their government and economic structure to mirror that of the United States, utilizing the same language, architecture, laws, government, and social hierarchy. Even the flag of Liberia mirrors that of the American flag. Liberia also shows clear American influence in the fact that it has not yet adopted the metric system. This brings me to another problem to add to the list of problems that I brought up earlier. Americo-Liberians viewed themselves as a distinct and superior ethnic group to the locals, in a system similar to that of the Jim Crow laws in America or Apartheid of Southern Africa. They did not integrate with the local Africans and largely married only other Americo-Liberians exclusively, all the while retaining their own ethnic identity, culture, and ways of life. Perhaps through centuries of brainwashing by their white masters back in the United States, their government, architecture, society, and culture showed clear influence from the plantations of southern United States, and what had been done to them by whites was now being done by them to the locals. Throughout their history, they did everything they could to keep their people in power, all the while subjugating the locals to intense discrimination, in addition to persistent attempts at civilizing them and promoting Western morals and values. One of the worst examples of this happened during an economic crisis in the year 1930, where they utilized indigenous people as forced laborers, in a system hardly distinguishable from slavery. Shortly after, the government was overthrown and the president was replaced by Edwin Barclay, who proceeded to re-evaluate the laws of Liberia. Over the next few decades, new mineral wealth was discovered, which increased government revenue and allowed for modernization to continue along the coastal regions. However, the interior populations that were almost entirely composed of indigenous people remained neglected and underdeveloped by the government. In 1944, President William Tubman allowed locals to participate in mainstream social and economic offices, and even allowed them the right to vote. Despite all of these changes, the Americo-Liberians still controlled the vast majority of the wealth and power of the nation, and the gap between them and the locals only widened. So he took more questionable approaches, such as allowing himself to have 7 consecutive terms in office, where he could remain until his death in 1971. By this time, the patience of the indigenous people grew thin, and they became increasingly less tolerant towards their Americo-Liberian rulers. Since most of the country lived in poverty, President William Tolbert tried to promote local industry by raising prices of imported goods, which were met with intense criticism from the locals. As a result of this, a 1980 military coup led by Samuel Doe murdered the president and 13 of his cabinet members, establishing a new government which they called the People's Redemption Council.